starting at 7. If you want to come, you're welcome to come and hear about some of the things we have done and will be doing. If you could go to the website and click the RSVP thing, so we have some idea of how many people are prepared for it. You'd be welcome there. When Anne called me last spring, inviting me to talk here, I was just in the process of abandoning the idea of teaching a course on violence. Because I felt like I didn't know enough about the topic to talk about it certainly for a whole 4 months. And then I thought, well, maybe I should accept this, and then I might have enough for one evening or an hour. But we'll see. We'll see. I did want to do this as a lecture, as a seminar. That is to say, I don't have my thoughts finished. I'm in the middle of them, and I want to share some of the in the middle feeling of those ideas with you, and perhaps get your help on where it needs to go. One of the things about being in the middle is that one consults what other people have done. So I'm going to quote from a few things that seem to me important along the way. So this is a sort of a meditation on the problem of violence, and I think I'm going to have to do it like this. I have to choose these days between either seeing my notes or seeing you, so you lose this time, I think. The first aspect of this meditation is it seems to me that the problem of violence goes to the very heart of thought in the humanities or social sciences. That is to say, we tend to think, I think if you poke somebody who's doing graduate studies or teaching in the fields of humanities and social sciences, that you think, at least I hope you think, that in some way what you're doing through the educative process leads to a diminution, or the hope of it, the tendency toward a diminution of violence in the world. In other words, there's some sort of healing or humanizing, civilizing. All of these are words which have come very much into question that we have to look at, but something like that seems to be involved in the basis of our studies. And the other thing is I'm going to spend a little time trying to classify kinds of violence. Now, everything that I'm reading on the topic pretty much needs to do that at some point in time. You might want to ask why. First off, violence is such a pressing issue in so many different ways, in so many different aspects of life these days, that there's a good argument, perhaps, that one should forget about the theoretical questions and get on with addressing something like the violent effects of poverty in downtown Vancouver, domestic violence, violence against women, war. There are plenty of thematic places where this is a problem. On the other hand, in order to know what we're talking about, what is the phenomenon of violence and what can one expect from studying it and intervening in it, you have to have, I think, some idea of what it is. What is violence? This is, of course, the Socratic question with which most inquiries have to deal at some point in time. What is it you're actually talking about? And violence is such a diffuse and almost all-pervasive sort of phenomenon that it is very hard to come up with such a definition. And so I think what our authors do, and what I'm actually going to do myself, is to not exactly dodge the question, but postpone it. And if you talk about certain different kinds of violence, we can then maybe at some point start to talk about what they have in common, or what is it, and can there be a diminution of violence? Can there be an end to violence? Is something like peace possible? So let me start. Another quick reflection is there are of course perennial problems, and there are problems that come and go. Now, violence is in a certain sense both of those, it seems to me. It's a perennial problem, coextensive with human history and existence. But at the same time, it seems that at certain points in time, we live in more violent times or less violent times. So one of the things that I've got in the back of my mind when I'm reflecting about violence and biopolitics is why now? What is it about now? Why is this question coming up now? Are there any certain aspects of the question that are particularly contemporary? Are there new challenges, new sorts of issues? So that's in the back of my mind as well. Now, perhaps a good place to start is with a distinction between what you might call an external delimitation of the problem of violence, a distinction of violence from power. In recent years, the locus classicus for that is from Hannah Arendt, who said that power corresponds to the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert. That is to say, acting together allows us to do things, and we do that doing of those things is power. Now, for her and thinkers who follow Arendt, as I will in some sense do, in a vague sense do today, it's very important to distinguish violence from power. She defines violence as power corresponds to the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert. She says also, violence is distinguished by its instrumental character. The implements of violence, like all other tools, are designed and used for the purpose of multiplying natural strength. Multiplying natural strength does not necessarily include social action with others. And notice the emphasis that it's a tool and a means. It's directed towards a certain very definite purpose. Whereas power, on the other hand, quite often is its own end. The exercise of power with others becomes itself, in a great sense of power. Now, that's not power over others, but power to do, power to construct the world, is something which is good for its own sake. It's got something to do with what humans are. So the distinction between power and violence is a way of trying to talk about the way in which that capacity to act, to change the world, and to form the world can be cut off by kind of instrumental incision into processes of power. Thus, she says also that violence often tends to substitute for power, or for politics. Power and politics more or less going together. Violence is a substitute, so we often see, for example, when constituted states disintegrate, as in the case of the former Yugoslavia, we have the political processes that were in place replaced by military processes and indeed genocidal actions. So to some extent, we can look at violence as in opposition to the problem of to the exercise of power. But it's also important to notice that violence does operate in the social world, so it does need some form of consent to operate. And one classic example of this now is in 1968 in Paris, when there were no workers were on strike and the students were there supporting the strike, and de Gaulle called out the army and put the tanks in front of the factory. They then sat there with the tanks facing the factory for about 3 days, I think it was. Nothing happened, you might say. But something was very much happening. And this is a phenomenon, the military being the best example of organized violence. I more or less take that without long argument. What happens, you've got to think, what happens if de Gaulle or the generals say, okay, fire? Now people, tanks of course don't fire themselves, and there's another thing to follow up in terms of contemporary technological, drones and things like that are going on now, but somebody always has to fire them. Now the problem is, of course, the young guys who are in the tanks are quite often come from the same small villages or have brothers and sisters who are working in the Renault factory or are students. Are they going to fire on them? Big question, of course, in the army, the one thing you can't do, of course, courses, just decide which orders you like to follow. You have to follow orders. If not, that's treason, right? If it's a wartime situation, you can be shot for that. So if the goal says fire and they don't fire, they have only one alternative: turn the guns around, right? Fire on the generals. There are situations like that, right? Situations in which violence threatens to break out and to be serious and decisive, and yet it doesn't, because to be coordinated and to be socially effective, it still requires a certain degree of consent. And that consent has to do with where people feel they belong, what side they feel they belong on. Another classic example of this, and I don't want to dwell too much on examples because I had thought we were going to go till 9, but we're supposed to be over by 8:30.
You got more time than you.
Yeah, well, I don't want to, we'll see how it goes. But another classical case is Tiananmen Square. You may know that wonderful film clip that's now all over the internet of the fellow with the briefcase who walks out and stands in front of the tank. The tank tries to go this way, it tries to go that way, and eventually stops, right? Now we all know, I take it, that if the tank wanted to go straight forward, it could go right over him, right? It doesn't have to try to go around him. The trying to go around shows you there's a need for consent. Somebody's driving that thing, and they have to go along with the policy. So while it's true that violence is distinct from power, at the same time, power can restrain violence, or at some degree, sense of acting in concert with others, some degree of your social action, your social belonging, it influences the exercise of violence in critical situations, right? So the two phenomena are often, while distinct theoretically, are often in practical situations very closely tied up with each other and interplay in very interesting ways. So, next comment about what is violence. It seems to me that there is some sort of inherent difficulty in thinking about thinking about violence. Now, it's difficult to think about anything, obviously, but a specific difference. If you, for example, have been subject of some kind of attack, right? If you've been beaten up, it's very hard to think about what happened to you. In many cases, if you want a report of a case of sexual violence or physical violence on the street, something like that, the last thing you expect from the person reporting it is a clear and accurate description of what happened, right? Why? Violence produces fear. Fear produces reactions like wanting to run away or flailing around doing something in a completely unorganized, perhaps irrational way. It doesn't lend itself to sitting down and figuring out what is exactly going on. And it seems to me, most of us have experienced, I would expect, times at which we have been subject to violence in our lives. And I think if you look at that experience yourself, you can perhaps confirm this. At least I ask you if you would confirm it. There's something about violence that doesn't want to be thought about. It seems to provoke an immediate reaction of run away, a counter-violence, something like that, but it seems to short-circuit thought. And that strikes me as an interesting fact. Violence, when exercised upon somebody, seems to demand that they retreat. You fall back, you become small, you don't want to be seen. It's a kind of I don't know quite how to describe what's the best kind of word to sum all these things up, but it's a kind of a retreat, a becoming small, a becoming not effective in the world. Yeah? And I think this is, first of all, a very good reason for seeing it as different from the phenomenon of power. Yeah? Power is the exercise of coming out, being able to change things, being able to be expressive in the world. Violence does exactly the opposite. It shuts you down, makes you feel small, makes you feel ineffective, makes you feel worthless. Right? So thinking about violence is difficult because we have to in some way, and usually we need distance, and sometimes people need help, right, to get over the trauma of the violent event to be able to think about it. Yeah? So one of the things that happens in trauma after traumatic events is people unconsciously and without meaning to repeat that event. They repeat it because they don't know how to get out of that circle of action, reaction, which doesn't go through thought. Yeah? It's just utterly immediate. So trying to think about violence and having a 13 or whatever it is, 12 lectures and a course to try to think about what is the phenomenon of violence and how it affects biopolitics is a very interesting and important thing to do, it seems to me. And it's also a very difficult thing to do, which is why I'm here with mostly a lot of half-organized semi-thoughts about it, as opposed to an actual theory of violence, which I don't have. The other thing that seems to come from this, it's related to this, is that the threat of violence is already violence. Yeah? If I go into a store and pull out a gun and point it at somebody, but don't fire it, yeah? It's still being used. It's still a means to affect the action of another person, right? So violence doesn't have to actually be exercised, it can be threatened. And it can be threatened also implicitly in the sense of we may know people who regularly respond violently to others. Once that is an established pattern of behavior, they don't have to even quite threaten anymore, like explicitly, because the threat is already there. Yeah? This applies to American foreign policy as well. So, a couple of thoughts. It's not just the act of violence, but the threat of violence. And I would use the word coercion to refer to what you might call a normalized threat. That is to say, a way in which people are coerced into doing things without explicit threats of violence, but because of a kind of normalized expectation that if you don't go along, that might be what might happen. So, many domestic situations, but also many socially organized situations and political systems work through what we might call institutionalized coercion. Now, the threat of violence doesn't have to be mentioned, it hovers in the background. And similarly, it cuts off thought. It cuts off thought. So very hard then to work out of that retreat into which coercive institutions push us to think about what our situation might be, to think one situation through, and to thereby possibly be able to change it, or possibly be able to address it in some sort of a way. This is, it seems to me, reflections of this sort are the basis of the classical expectation that the humanities and the social sciences, and let's say advanced education in general, have some kind of humanizing or civilizing effect. That is to say, by putting these things under a regime of thought, of finally working them through, one frees them oneself and gets some distance from that immediate circle of action, reaction. And that would be a way of being able to act then with others to address situations in a more thought-out, long-term way. So I would hope that my reflections eventually, probably not tonight, but eventually will lead to some sort of sense of why it is, or how it is, that education, and I mean, I don't mean educational institutions, you'll understand me. I mean education in the sense of learning to reflect on one's social experience can help to maximize peace, let's say. Another still fairly initial reflection. It's correct to say, it seems to me, that violence is a means towards an end. And so the temptation very quickly is to say, well, what justifies it is not whether it's violent or not violent, but whether it achieves its end or not. And what is its end? If it's a good end, maybe it's a good violence. some uses of the word terrorism and terrorists and so on may bring to mind these sorts of things. The Algerian revolutionary movement, for example, in the 1950s, was routinely referred to as terrorists until they won. Then they founded their own country, and at that point in time, they're not terrorists; they're a state. So there is some sense in which it does depend what the point is, what the goal or the end is. But it still seems to me possible to say that, and this would be another reason why it may be good to look at a specific case rather than to engage in general reflections on the nature of violence in general. But because it really does depend what is being intended. On the other hand, one can claim to intend anything, and you get into the problem of just because I'm doing this to create a more equal and wonderful world, does that mean any forms of violence are justified? So it seems to me, in some sense, even though violence is a means and the end can't be ignored, still one has to focus on this phenomenon itself and say, what is it? And how does it work, and so forth. And a fourth, and I think final initial reflection, it seems to me that violence is, in the most basic sense, to do with the body. So it is a kind of fundamental phenomenon of biopolitics, and in this sense, though not being particularly attracted to Michel Foucault and the gamut and all of that, and the people who are routinely using the word biopolitics on every second sentence, nonetheless, it's a good topic for a seminar, because violence is about closing down the possibilities of the human body, it seems to me. Making the body, rather than expansive entry into the world, a retreat. An object which is acted upon in the world. So this to me is a very fundamental and important problem. It's been noted by a number of authors. Let me quote you then. I mentioned also Hannah Arendt. She refers to violence as multiplying natural strength. Strength, of course, is usually exercised in this context by one against another. John Keane, in his book from about 15 years ago, Reflections on Violence, which is quite a good book, says, violence is better understood as the unwanted physical interference by groups and or individuals with the bodies of others. And Jan Assmann, who writes about monotheism as a form of violence, about which I won't say anything much tonight, says, however, that violence is physical violence. So I think it's worth starting from the idea that violence is, in the first place, a physical phenomenon. Now, we do talk about psychological violence, we do talk about institutionalized violence, systemic violence, and so on. But I think we do so because of, as I explained before, the routinization of the threat. Institutions are violent insofar as they're coercive. That is to say, they have a routinized threat of the use of violence. So when we talk about psychological violence, we build out a metaphor out of that physical, biopolitical, if you like, fundamental reality. Another interesting, much more recent book is by Richard Bernstein, a good philosopher, I think, from the New School for Social Research in New York. This recent book, Violence Thinking Without Banisters. He, however, says he wants to focus on how forms of violence turn into physical violence. Strikes me as somehow getting the cart before the horse, getting it backwards. Surely violence is in the first place a physical phenomenon, but a phenomenon of the body which then is extended more widely. Not that we have forms of institutionalized violence that then become physical. Yeah? Seems to me that physical threat is the starting point. So I would argue to you anyway. So I'm going to work with a provisional definition. These are my first reflections. A provisional definition of violence. That it's a bodily means of breaking into the bodies of others. A hitting, a cutting, a blowing up, but in some way an intervention from outside. I think what that means is that violence is a kind of an interruption of an internal logic of development or growth. Yeah? You might want to say, for example, that there are coercive, if you can see remember the relation I've set up here between coercion and violence. Yeah, there's a coercive effect, for example, of not allowing children to go to school, or not systematically not allowing girls to be educated. You might want to call that violence, insofar as it's coercive, insofar as it doesn't allow the continued internal development of that person's body and personality. So my first provisional definition has to do with violence as a kind of cutting in, which interferes with the sort of internal logic of development or growth. Now, I turn to a little bit about classifications, commenting on a few other people's, and then I'll give you my own.
Can I ask a very quick clarification?
Yeah, sure.
The experience of violence in your definition then is had by the person, only by the person cut into, or by both parties, that one?
Okay, good point. I guess I am defining the phenomenon on the basis of what it does to the person who is the victim. Clearly it also is experienced by the person who is doing the victimizing. And that's going to be a different experience. And that's worth saving and thinking about, but I haven't really foregrounded it in what I'm doing. You get a lot of, in fact, Richard Bernstein does this, which I think is unfortunate. People who refer to violence and say, well, how many kinds of violence are there? How do you classify them? And just say things like, well, there's psychological, social, political, religious, etc., which essentially amounts to listing off the departments of the university and attaching violence to them. It's not very helpful. Partly because any single phenomenon, any actual phenomenon, talk about the genocides in the former Yugoslavia, for example, they're going to have physical and psychological and social and political, effects, right? It's one phenomenon in that sense. So these are not kinds of violence; these are aspects of a phenomenon which is a unity. And the other disadvantage of that would be that you're actually going to be losing an opportunity to do what I think the organizers of the seminar are trying to do here, which is to use a basic, important human phenomenon as a standpoint for reflection, which is interdisciplinary and therefore much more immediately related to our social world, and kind of divert it off into kind of a disciplinary sort of thing, which would be kind of a bad mistake, I think. So Bernstein's book does that, unfortunately. Slavoj Žižek, who is everywhere these days, has three types of violence in his recent book, also I think it's 2013. I know the displeasure of the contemporary by saying I don't think it's a very good book, but it has a lot of interesting little stories in it, as his stuff usually does. He has a three-way distinction, which is, I think, quite helpful. He distinguishes symbolic violence from systemic violence and what he calls subjective violence. So symbolic violence comes from the very use of language. It's what you might call metaphysical violence. It comes with the human condition, it's always here with us, and it maybe will never go away. Systemic violence, he means the violence of economic, political, social systems. And subjective violence, the violence of individuals. Somebody punches someone else because they don't like the look of their face or something like that. So, there are several advantages to this phenomenon, it seems to me. One, it does break it down in a useful kind of way to different sorts of phenomena. But the other thing is that it makes clear what I think is a very important point, which is that acts of individual violence always occur against the background of a social institutional system. And that social institutional system has, as I mentioned, I'll say a little bit more about this, organized means of coercion in it. So you can never really look at, and if you want to think about it, if you want to prosecute somebody, that's a different thing. But if you want to think about what the phenomenon is, you can only look at, it seems to me, individual acts of violence against the background of the institutionalized framework. And that is an advantage of what Zizek has done in his book. When he wants to talk about symbolic violence, he goes back to Heidegger, and he refers to Heidegger's introduction to metaphysics, which is not an introduction to anything at all. It's a pretty complicated book. But Heidegger talks about, he doesn't call it symbolic violence, he would call it metaphysical violence, I think. But it's developed in the context of an interpretation of Sophocles' play Antigone, in which he talks about the violence of creation. Now, this is I'm going to read this piece to you. I think it's quite interesting. He goes through his whole thing on Sophocles, and then sums it up this way. Use violence as violence doers, and become those who rise high in historical being as creators, as doers. Rising high in the sight of history, they also become apolis, without city in sight, lonesome, uncanny, with no way out amidst beings as a whole, and at the same time without ordinance and limit, without structure and fittingness, because they as creators must first ground with us all in each case. Now I take that to mean that there is a similarity between violence and creation, insofar as the creator has to stand beyond what is given and organized and is developing naturally its own growth, you might say, and to put into place something. And violence in a certain way does that. So for Heidegger, there is a metaphysical violence in being human as such, which has to do with the setting into place of new things. Yeah? New things must also always mean a rupture with the old. Now, all of this is very interesting. It's Zizek's source for talking about symbolic violence, and it's very closely related to what Jan Assmann wants to do in his books about monotheism, in which he wants to argue that certain religious systems are more inclined towards a violent formulation of the relationship to those who don't share that religion than others. But that's a theme, as I said, it needs to be mentioned if you're classifying the phenomenon, but it's not where I'm going to place my emphasis tonight. So, those are a few just fairly random, and I shortened them a little bit, comments on what other people have said in the way of classifying. I want to now present to you a classification of 5 kinds of violence, and I'm going to spend more time on some than others, and use it to make some kind of concluding reflections. And these are in order of, well, probably in truth they're in no particular order, but they're not in the order of what is the grounding phenomenon and what is derived or anything like that. They're perhaps in the order more of what is more easily perceived or what might be more ordinary experience, kind of building away from that as we go. So first I'm going to mention criminality and war. Classic definition of the state that has entered into almost all social science is by Max Weber. He says, the state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence within a given territory. The legitimate use of violence means not legitimate in some Max Weber or some esoteric philosopher's point of view, but legitimate seen by the people who are within that state. Do they see it as legitimate? So when a serial killer is arrested and put into jail, that's a violent act. But I'm not going to argue that it shouldn't have happened. In other words, the violence that was used is legitimate in my view. And when the whole population views it as legitimate, it functions as a normalized kind of violence. But in any case, the criminal system, the criminal justice system, is a form of coercion. It's normalized threat of violence. The thing that's not usually pointed out about this is that Max Weber got this definition from Trotsky. And it's essentially a statement of the Bolshevik conception of the state. Similarly, war is legitimate violence, that is to say, seen as legitimate by the population, and, as I pointed out at the beginning, bear in mind, all exercise of violence requires some form of consent, so it's quite possible for a population to raise questions about the legitimacy. Is that legitimacy real and properly shared? So you have crises over the prosecutions of war, Vietnam War, classic example now, in which the population is radically divided about whether the war should be prosecuted or not. So I'm not saying, when I say, I'm trying to warn you off certain natural connotations of the word legitimate. It's being used in a specific kind of sociological sense here. Prosecution of war. Prosecution of criminals and prosecution of war are the acts of a constituted state. State in our time is the main form of political organization, but it's not always. The state isn't always the dominant form of political organization. As you probably know, in more ancient times, cities were more independent and so forth. So I actually mean not the state in that sense, but any form of constituted authority defines certain acts as criminal and gives itself the right to prosecute wars against others. Okay, fairly straightforward. The second form of violence I want to talk about is often one of the most contentious and important, and that's systemic violence. Violence within an organized and constituted order. A constituted order contains coercive mechanisms, and it's therefore possible for a population or members of that society to decide at some point in time that those coercive mechanisms are not necessary or exceed or pursue goals that ought not to be pursued. And it's possible to try to have a revolutionary overthrow of that system. So the concept of systemic violence essentially seems to me be related to the concept of revolutionary violence, which I'll come to in a moment just afterwards. Revolutionary violence is an attempt to overthrow a constituted coercive order. But staying with systemic violence for a moment, I want to observe something which complicates this picture a little bit, especially from the viewpoint of thinking about revolutionary violence. A constituted state has coercive mechanisms, but it also contains norms of civility, things of ways in which people ought to be treated. So we can say, for example, I think without any exaggeration, that the Canadian state is coercive with regards to its historical and contemporary role with relationship to Aboriginal people. This becoming, thankfully, much more on the political agenda now than it has been for some time, which is a good thing. But it's also complicated by the fact that the Canadian state, that same Canadian state, is the one that says you can't be arbitrarily arrested. You can't be just beaten up and thrown in a ditch. If you are, we've got the police and the organized forms of coercion to come and try and do something about that. So the state has seems to me, has a complicated dual role in which it both enforces through the criminal justice system and so on, organizes what we could call norms of civility. And at the same time, and many of those same laws, depending on how they're applied, can be coercive with regards to certain groups or individuals within. So it's a difficult choice. It's not clear. The concept of systemic violence does lead one to think of the potential legitimacy of revolutionary violence for overthrowing that organized coercion. But at the same time, and this is usually a conservative argument, but it seems to me it does have some legitimacy. The question is it overthrowing all forms of order? What kind of order is going to be put into place after the revolutionary overthrow? Are there going to be, can you assume that there are going to be the same sorts of, or some analogous forms of protections of civility? And of course, I'm getting a bit into what I want to say about revolutionary violence, but one of the classic problems, it seems to me, that we've now inherited from the 20th century is the fact that the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, 1917, and all revolutions on that model have ended up putting into place a system of coercion that was, in fact, at least as great and probably greater in terms of the ability to coerce individuals than that which it replaced. So the fact of saying that there is systemic violence doesn't automatically legitimate revolutionary violence. In fact, there's a kind of a judgment in there. It's a space for judgment, it seems to me, in which, in some circumstances, large parts of the population would opt for revolutionary violence. And sometimes people would not do so precisely because they feel there are some norms of civility within the constituted order. Now, this seems to me to be an area in which there's a lot of thinking required, because at least what I've read about revolutionary violence doesn't take nearly seriously enough the problem of how to set up an order that has some protections, to either keep some, one way to put it is to keep some continuity with liberal democratic freedoms, that's one way to put it, or to institutionalize individual freedoms from forms of self-organization, to put it in a slightly more anarchistic way. But in any case, not centralize all the power in a coercive state. Now that's a problem I won't go into. I thought about maybe just talking about this tonight, because it does seem to me to be one of the hugest problems that any form of attempt to address systemic violence in our time must really think about. The fact that many of the revolutionary movements have put into place worse coercive systems than that which they attempted to supplant. But I should add, not all. I'm not saying all, and I'm not saying it's necessary. I'm saying it needs to be thought about. Revolutionary violence, to move on to the third one, is a means. It's an attempt to overthrow a constituted political order because the inequalities and that are supported by the coercive system of the state are such that people have had enough, and it needs to be changed. So it's revolutionary violence is a means attempting to overthrow a coercive system. And therefore, a lot depends upon the end achieved. I made a bit of a reference to the Soviet Union. It seems to me that by the time you get to the Stalin era of the Soviet Union, it's pretty clear that it's pretty much a toss-up now between whether it would have been better to stay with the Tsar or whether you're better off with Stalin. You know? Not that anybody actually has that choice, of course, but you need to ask the question of why it is this form of revolutionary overthrow has put into place such a centralized and thorough system. And we've got other examples, thank goodness. I think particularly Cuba and Nicaragua. And I guess if one really wanted to think this through, one would have to ask the question of what would be a sufficient criteria of success for you to say that the revolutionary violence was justified. Yeah. It's pretty, in the ecstatic first moments, of winning the revolution, in 1960 and so on, 1960, 61, 62 in Cuba. I think many people would see the benefit side, but there is a logic, which I want to talk about in a moment, which is worrisome. When my wife Viviana and I were in Cuba some years ago, before the whole change in 1989, we saw an old man reading a book, right? An old peasant reading a book. You think, how is that possible? Right? This is a peasant from before 1960. It's because of the year, what was it, 63 maybe, when they closed down the universities and sent all the university students into the fields to teach the peasants how to read. Yeah? Now that is some achievement, I would say, and some achievement which does something towards saying that the revolutionary violence is indeed justified, in my view. But these are political matters in which there's not a simple yes or no to them. They're forms of judgment that we have to make. I give that example just to point out that it seems to me that it is the case that revolutionary violence is justified in some cases. Now, one thinker in particular has gone farther to suggest that revolutionary violence may not only be necessary, but it may be liberating in itself. Frantz Fanon, one of the important theorists of the Algerian Revolution, and I want to read this to you because it has had enormous effects. Okay, I'm going to start having to go faster, or I'll maybe just drop some things out. We have said that the natives' violence unifies the people. By its very structure, colonialism is separatist and regionalist. Colonialism does not simply state the existence of tribes, it also reinforces it and separates them. The colonial system encourages chieftaincies and keeps alive the old Marabout confraternities. Violence is in action all-inclusive and national. It follows that it is closely involved in the liquidation of regionalism and tribalism. Even if the armed struggle has been symbolic and the nation is demobilized through a rapid movement of decolonization, the people have time to see that the liberation has been the business of each and all, and that the leader has no special merit. When the people have taken violent part in the national liberation, they will allow no one to set themselves up as liberators. Illuminated by violence, the consciousness of the people rebels against any pacification. Now, this is the strongest defense I know of the creative power of revolutionary violence, independently of the actual conditions. Am I not saying that quite right? of the end that's produced, but because it becomes a galvanizing factor, yeah, a unifying factor, and that this is exercise of violence not against any arbitrarily chosen person, by the way, but against colonialists. It's important. It's violence back against an already violent and coercive system. And important to remember. Nevertheless, he is suggesting that the violence itself is the creative moment. In my mind, very similar to Heidegger's kind of metaphysical thing. It's got the violence, the breaking out and getting into something new is itself a violence and is itself creative. Now, Fanon has had a lot of influence. And one example I can give you from those of you who like films is a film by Jean-Luc Godard, and I forget which one it is, maybe you remember it.
La Chinoise.
No, not La Chinoise. The one where the workers take over the factory, and they've got the boss sequestered in this room, and he needs to go to the bathroom, right? And they say, does anybody remember the name of the film? Tu vas bien. And they say, no, can't go to the bathroom. Sorry. And he said, well, this is inhuman, you know, how can you treat a person like this? Well, of course, it was a very well done film. One of the women who works on the production line at the factory says, this is what happens to us every day. We have to ask permission, we can't leave, you just hold it until, you're right, it's dehumanizing. Try it out for us, right? Now you can see there is something in this, right? So the reciprocal violence can be liberating in some ways, it seems to me. But, and there's a big but, which I don't know I can really talk about in any kind of an adequate way. But the problem with this, if I can use the Godard example, and I'm no longer talking about the film, I'm just using that as a way of talking about a phenomenon, is that somebody is still deciding when someone else can take a leak. Right? The coercive system has not gone, it's been shifted around, it's become a mirror, right? And the moment at which it is switched around, and it is literally the person who has suffered getting the chance to say, now I do it to you, there is a liberating moment in that, right? The problem is, what happens then? If that continues to go on the same way, then we have the same thing. We have the same system of coercion. And I think at this moment I'm just going to leave this as a kind of metaphor for you rather than try to talk about the problems of institutionalized revolutionary violence. But what has happened in many post-revolutionary situations, after colonial revolutions and after communist revolutions, is that a new system of coercion has come into place, which is essentially mirroring the old system of coercion. So we have inherited the very difficult problem of how to break out of systems of coercion, to allow that moment of reversal, I think, which without that moment of reversal, it seems to me there is no revolutionary violence. And with no revolutionary violence, there is no overturning the system of the systemic violence. But how do you do that without institutionalizing it again? Yeah? And thereby just creating the circle of self-repeating violence. Now it seems to me that it would, sometimes I really wish I could have lived in the first part of the late part of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century, and just would have been so much easier to just outright be a revolutionary. Because this dynamic had not come into place yet. But we have seen it now. So we're in a kind of post-colonial time as opposed to a colonial time. And much as Fanon was a brilliant thinker and an important thinker, I don't think any of us can read that today and the justification of revolutionary violence without saying somewhere in our mind, but what then? But what then, you know? From the argument I made that a constituted political system is both a system of coercion and the enforcement through that system of coercion of certain norms of civility. If the social system, rather than being asserting itself, or rather than being overthrown in a revolutionary way, rather just simply starts to fall apart, you get a phenomenon which it seems to me is not reflected in any of these other forms of violence, and in any of the ones that I've actually seen discussed. Take, for example, the world drug trade. Now, is it organized? You bet it's organized. Yeah? It's a form of social organization in many ways, right? Of recruitment, of systemic violence, of et cetera, But, so it's not just, it's criminality, but it's not just criminality. Yeah? It seems to come from the inability of constituted political orders to control this phenomenon, on the one hand, to brand it and keep it as a simply criminal matter. Yeah? But it doesn't, at the same time, aim at any kind of revolutionary transfer of organized coercion. It doesn't aim at any kind of better, it's not justified by its means towards a better end. It's just, it seems to me to come from a form of social disintegration or quasi-disintegration. It's kind of quasi-disintegrated and quasi-order. I think there are two main consequences of this, and I think this is what we've seen a lot of in recent times. First of all, the destruction of the compact between the sexes, the genders, such that violence against women becomes an increasing phenomenon. And a much more violent phenomenon. You might argue, I was thinking about this quite a lot before I came here, you might well argue that there's a system of systemic coercion of women in many social systems, and I would be willing to agree with that. But it seems to be not quite comparable to what happens when you have the disintegration of constituted order, like in some of the states of former Eastern Europe. You get sexual slavery, you get trafficking, you get forms of organized brutality that I don't think any states, short of possibly Nazi regimes, contemplate. So this seems to me to be not quite properly understood under any of the other categories. And the other thing that happens is you get mob violence and the phenomenon of the big man starting up his own private army. I think that this comes from the disintegration of the social order, including the coercive mechanisms of that social order, disintegration both of the coercive mechanisms and of the norms of civility. Some people have called this a return to a state of nature, but that's just, it seems to be not a helpful way of looking at it. First of all, this is no original situation. Human societies are always organized, and this comes from the disintegration of something organized. It's not a kind of original state. And it seems to me that this form of violence could never have been original. It precisely comes through a disintegration. Very prescient comment of Jacques Derrida, which I've thought about a lot over the years. He said, deconstruction, this is before he started to popularize his own work and be less accurate about what he was saying, but he said, deconstruction is not something one does, it is something that happens. And we are living in a time which is being deconstructed. Yeah? And I think that that is the closest thought that I can find to what I'm calling here a logic of social disintegration. Things are falling apart. Deconstruction means essentially falling apart. So that you have some pieces left, but they don't fit together in the way that they used to. And certain phenomena come out. So I'm going to try, I think, to jump to a conclusion of some sort. of these relatively disorganized reflections.
Could you just quickly say what number 5 would have been?
Number 5 was social disintegration. I jumped right over number 4, which is metaphysical violence again.
Okay.
Yeah. We seem to me to be in a situation in which a lot of people are willing to opt for what they know is systemic violence and coercion, without idealizing it, because the violence of social disintegration looks one hell of a lot worse. So that it's not so much that you expect much from the state, but you expect some kind of order. You know? You don't expect things to be just completely random and horrible. It's awfully hard to justify revolutionary violence in a situation like this, because the systemic violence doesn't seem like the worst alternative. If you follow what I'm trying to say here. It also poses some problems for those of us who might associate ourselves with some kind of self-organizing anarchism or libertarian socialism or council communism or whatever you might want to call it. That's a whole kind of discussion in itself. But what I mean is a political perspective that sees as the primary good of humans something I think quite consistent with Hannah Arendt's notion of power, people's ability to organize together, to achieve things, to create the world they want to live in. The problem is that requires disrupting the system in some way, and that disruption now is haunted by the worst alternative, which is just social disintegration. How do you know you're involved in a revolutionary violence and not just promoting greater social disintegration? It seems to me, I've been wondering ever since 1989, right? Ever since the fall of communism, why is it that the fall of communism didn't liberate a certain kind of quasi-Marxist or, revolutionary alternative within the West? It hasn't. It seemed possible to say, theoretically it's very possible to say, that communism, capital C, had nothing to do with Marx. Had nothing to do with council communism. There are all kinds of, murdered comrades in that history that need to be remembered. But it really just has not happened. Yeah. It's because of it seems to me, a much greater disillusionment than just the failure of communism. It's the failure, we can at least imagine the failure of political order itself. That it could just disintegrate into cycles of reciprocated violence and the destruction of all forms of social ties. So, final words. Walter Benjamin once said in his wonderful and enigmatic thesis on the philosophy of history, there is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. Now, I think that one whole element of what I've been saying is completely in agreement with that. I've been trying to show how I think institutionalized coercion and violence is a persistent problem that has to be addressed. That much agrees with Benjamin. But the problem is, you can't reverse this statement. Can you say there is no document of barbarism that is not also a document of civilization? See, if you could be nice and dialectical and reasonably happy. You could think, well, okay, we may be risking social disintegration, but out of that will come new norms of civility. Unfortunately, if there is anything to this notion of the logic of social disintegration, it would explain why that hope is just not possible. That whatever alternative there is must also reckon with how to put into place a form of order which guarantees some norms of civility and has some built-in sorts of limitations to the centralization of coercive power. I think it explains why there's a lack of hope. Now, it's not nice to explain why there's a lack of hope. It's not encouraging, for sure, because hope is needed. But it may be helpful because it is part, I think, well, look around, decide whether you agree with me. But it seems to me that the lack of hope has a lot to do with why these problems of revolutionary violence and so on, the legitimacy of attacking organized coercion doesn't have any widespread or much widespread support. Even though I think people see the organized coercion as well as maybe more than ever. So essentially what I'm saying is this. There are logics of violence. It's not just this is violent, that's not, this is it. Violence has ways in which it somehow repeats itself, it calls forward further actions. And we're in a position where we need to understand those logics. And I'm particularly worried by the logic of social disintegration, because I don't know how you act to critique and oppose institutionalized coercion, which I think is a very important thing to do, but how you do that while at the same time proposing, institutionalizing in some way, putting forward norms of civility that would hopefully somehow get us out of this repetition of cycles. That's it.
In your reflections on violence, is there any way, or have you given thought to violence that isn't just an affair among humans? So the violence that is inflicted on say, place or land or non-human others, and how that would maybe cause some sort of illumination of a lot of the struggles that are happening here on this land today, this pipeline, these sort of things, where the critique of violence isn't just attached to their effect on human life.
Yeah. The short answer is yes, I've given some thought to it. But I don't know that I could have said anything even halfway organized about that. So that's why I jumped over this problem of metaphysical violence, and then I skipped the piece, as Lady pointed out here, for reasons of time. But when Heidegger connects creation to destruction in that way, to creation to violence, one question that I ask about that, and I know very well you ask about that, is that part of the Western history, which is not universal? And it does relate to Jan Assmann's brilliant work on monotheism as a form of violence. So I'm very interested, but I haven't got a coherent thing to say yet. Yes? Back at the back.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks for your talk. I would like to ask for several points of kind of clarification around the question of disintegration. Firstly, you kind of referred briefly, well, this is towards the end, to the idea of a compact between the sexes or genders and that disintegrating. I would like to ask for clarification of what you mean by that, because I don't understand patriarchy to be either a compact or a disintegration of a compact. And I don't understand male violence against women, if you want to frame it that way, to be either of those things either. And then relatedly, I want to ask why you position disintegration as a violence in and of itself, rather than perhaps a rhetorical device and an argument for enforcing the kinds of violent ordering, like kinds of violent orderings instead. Like social disintegration has been, and like ungovernability is kind of a trope, like in terms of colonial anxieties, like legitimizing particular interventions of ordering, which are in and of themselves violent. So it troubles me that to hear like social disintegration being discussed straight up as like the form of violence rather than like a tool for, like a rhetorical tool for like the perpetuation of violence. And especially, I mean, I think a good example that ties back to the male violence point is that an example of where orderings are violent, and you mentioned trafficking, is that for example, in countries where prostitution is kind of decriminalized and regulated, so brought under the orderings and the kind of eye of the state in terms of women in prostitution having to pay taxes and be monitored, etc., etc. Rates of human trafficking go through the roof in those countries. And that seems to be a clear example of where ordering creates violence. So, yeah, anyway, that's all.
Well, I think I hadn't actually thought, you made a number of points there, I'm trying to link them together, but I hadn't actually thought that, you're quite right, and I hadn't thought this, that when I say logic of social disintegration, that actually is a conservative trope, a conservative political trope, and I hadn't really thought about that. And yes, you're right, that it can be used as a kind of fear tactic to get people to not want to confront their situations. But on the other hand, I guess I would say that it does happen. So lots of things can be used politically, like fear of the external enemy can be used, manipulated over, quite often for political purposes, but it doesn't mean there are no external enemies. Sometimes there are. So I would say that. Now, the last point you made, you made a point about patriarchy. I think I made a space in what I was saying, though I must admit I didn't dwell on it for very long, that under the concept of coercion, I don't mean to suggest that forms of institutionalized social political forms are kind of egalitarian, or certainly not utterly egalitarian. But they nevertheless are forms of organization, right? So, but patriarchy to me comes under the category of a form of systemic coercion. It's not, it seems to me, now this is a very arguable point, and I know that a lot of people probably disagree with me about this, and I'll tell you a story about that if you like. But it seems to me it is not the same as the kind of violence between the sexes that emerges in places like Croatia and Serbia and so on, or Rwanda for that matter. I made the remark in a talk or a discussion up at Simon Fraser University during the 1990s when this was going on in the ex-Yugoslavia, that the systematic raping of Muslim women was a form of use of anthropological knowledge. That is to say, it was a form of individualized violence against those individuals. But it was also, because of the nature of Muslim beliefs, a systematic attack at the social fabric of those societies. Now, I got a lot, in fact, 3 of my women colleagues were very angry about this. And for some reason, they seemed to think I was justifying the practice, which I think they didn't really want to attribute that to me, but I think that they couldn't understand this. I've thought about this really a lot in the last 15 years to try to figure out what made them so angry. And the only way in which I can really understand it is they seem to think that using anthropological knowledge had to be a good thing. And so when I was saying they were using anthropological knowledge, it somehow had to be for an end that was a beneficial end. Now, it seems to me that any form of knowledge can be used for destructive purposes. So when I distinguish violence of social disintegration, I'm going to be very willing to agree with you that it could be misused rhetorically. And I'm going to be quite willing to suggest, to agree with you that patriarchy is a form of systemic coercion. But is it the same? Your last point had to do with systemic coercion increasing violence. It certainly can, but it seems to me that it's actually the symbiosis between the organized Western countries and the disintegrated other ones that creates the phenomenon you're talking about. It's not just the phenomenon of those constituted states. So I would say there is I would try to rejoin, agree with some of what you said, but try to come back with the notion that there is a phenomenon, this is a phenomenon of social disintegration, what I would want to argue. Yes, Samir?
Yeah, thanks a lot for your talk this evening. I do want to push you a little bit on your interpretation of phenol, which I take to be a fairly conventional one, in that phenol represents this kind of, we would say, metaphysical form, ontological form of violence, as well as a form of revolutionary violence. The two are closely tied. And the question that I would have for you is, it certainly is that, but is it not also an auto-critique? Isn't it also the performance of a critique of violence in the Wretched of the Earth in particular?
In what way?
Well, insofar as your talk is really focused on the logic of violence, and one way of reading the Wretched of the Earth is to think of it in terms of a meditation also on the violence of logic. So the logic of violence, but the violence of logic. And this is an argument that our friend makes, Ato Seshiotu, in his book on Phenol, which is a fantastic book, by the way, Phenol's Dialectic of Liberation. And he argues essentially that the crucial move in Wretched of the Earth is a movement from an Aristotelian logic, right, of mutual exclusivity, where the colonizers and colonized face off, and it really is spatially organized as separatists, and that's the one that's confronted by violence initially. But that violence then gives way to, or that view of the world gives way to a dialectical logic of differentiation, and that's where class comes into being. So the persistence of the national bourgeoisie, right, which is his main problem in that text, is that systematic violence, right? It's a persistence of colonialism after the colonists have been driven out. So in a sense, there's maybe a complicated phenomenon there that might be more of use to us than this sort of sense that it's about this kind of the revolutionary elan of violence.
I haven't read Ato Seshiotu's book on phenol. It did come to my mind this last week, and I thought, like so many other things, better not do that before this, otherwise it might disrupt everything I want to say. But there's a lot more that goes on in phenol, and so. But it does seem to me that you can, if you interpret it to such a degree as to take out the notion that there is a cleansing and liberating violence in phenol, then that would be a bit of an overinterpretation. The question I was trying to point to is there any limitation within this? And it seems to me that phenol, as in Lenin and Bolshevism in general, does contain the same problem. It contains a problem of you attack systemic violence, but you set up a new system which has no limitation of its centralized power whatsoever. And it seems to me that we don't, maybe if you're right, maybe people who know a lot more finance than me could argue that that what he says is ultimately mitigated. I would be more inclined to want to say that it's a question of setting into place forms of organization that give it. I did have a piece that I didn't talk about for reasons of time, and Stephen Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement in South Africa, which was, I think, a very, and consciousness raising groups of women's liberation in the 60s and early 70s, which attempt to produce exactly that form of unification and self-confidence without violence. So it would seem to me, I would want to argue that to place the liberating component on the violence is a mistake. And I don't see how you can say it doesn't do that. It's
well, not saying it is really a moment, but maybe just to, I think also to add to your distinction between violence and power, it is in a sense there's a moment of violence that passes on into a moment of power and therefore politics per se.
Yeah.
Which then leads to the building of new institutions, etc. So, anyway.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Maybe.
We've got time for 3 more questions, but Ian will still be here afterwards. So.
You want me to choose?
Yeah.
I'm systematically ignoring the people I know.
Very question. You consider interactions, say, or the role of violence in sport. Would you actually concede that there can be such a thing, considering, I guess, consensual to a certain degree, but it certainly doesn't seem to fit any definitions of violence. But then when we look at what its effect are, and you define, well, you said that violence was, I guess, not expressive, but was a way of becoming not effective. And to me, particularly in contact sports, that's the exact opposite of what's been expected of the players involved. They're expected to be, it's the act of becoming more effective, that it's a spectacle. It's very opposite of becoming not expressive. Have you got any thoughts on?
I haven't thought about sport too much, but I probably would walk on both sides of the street at the same time. I mean, I'd share a lot of people's disgust at kids getting their brains bashed out and playing hockey, but at the same time, I think if I were to deal theoretically with the problem of violence in sport, it would be as a sublimated form of war. So the Olympic Games being essentially a substitute for the Greeks for actual violence. The competition is sublimated violence, and therefore it is right. More sublimation, the better. Basically, you don't want to let the desires run free. You need to run them through thought, and thought requires a distance, and that requires some breaking. So in general, this is where I'm on the other side of the street. It seems to me a certain amount of violence in sport is a way of sublimated expression that is helpful.
Yeah,
in
it's
general.
like one carnival,
Yeah. Brooke, you had your hand up for one.
Well, yes,
I didn't look over here, by the way, so, yeah, sorry.
I'm certainly one of those who'd be quite happy to be quoting Foucault or other people in this context. And I think I really laud your hopefulness that there's a possibility of setting up a set of institutions that somehow avoid the use of coercion, but I don't believe it. And I guess I'm wondering about the value judgment, that this notion of judging an end or the means by the end. Because I'm not coming up with an example. And you mentioned Malparis or Cuba. But I guess the jury's still out. And in terms of coercion, there's certainly been a hell of a lot of coercion in both of those contexts as well, and violence. And I'm not convinced that there's the possibility of having a good government or a good concentration of power, no matter how diffuse we try to make it, without the end essentially reproducing those things. And so I guess what I'm wondering about, patriarchy was mentioned, we talked about colonialism, all of these things were considered to be, and are by majorities of areas still considered to be legitimate, and legitimate uses of violence.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I'm stumbling over where the notion of Weberian legitimacy can possibly ever emerge into something that it's almost as though there's some sort of platonic form of government that we're looking for. That'll be the one that works. And I guess I don't buy it.
Well, I'm not arguing.
But the question I have is, what means would you have to make that judgment?
That judgment being?
That we have a good government, that we've reached that form.
Okay.
Because you keep talking about the hope for this, that we've got to set up something that has not so centralized, that doesn't repeat these mistakes, but how would you go about judging that?
I didn't in any point in time associate myself with Weber's conception of legitimacy, other than to use it to explain what I think state violence is, state systemic violence. And I certainly do not imagine a social system entirely free of coercion, except possibly as an ideal of utopia that maybe, that can't be instantiated on the earth. So I don't think I ever committed myself to saying that the perfect society is around the corner, or even a likely project. But what recognizing that, I still want to say that at times revolutionary violence is justified. And how can I justify it? Well, I don't think it's a kind of thing one can justify without relation to specific situations and conditions. I mean, Samir is perfectly right to point out, I mean, Fanon is not trying to give you a general theory of violence. He's trying to show you the role of violence in the Algerian Revolution. But it seems to me, I've been a bit dismayed in the turn of things. I'm very interested in the non-violence of peace and so on, but I'm very dismayed with the people who take that to the point of view of, in principle, ruling out revolutionary violence. And so that's what I was... Now, is there a kind of decision theorem, a decision procedure for this? No. No, there isn't. It's the kind of thing, people make different decisions, judgments based upon their situation and their understanding. And it's never everybody on the same side. That's what revolutions are about. So, if you want me to justify my specific judgments, things have been bad in Cuba, but they're better off now than they were under Batista. And fine with me. I mean, not that it matters to anybody that's fine with me. That's a kind of silly way of talking about history. But I do think that what they've been trying to do in Venezuela has some very positive aspects to it, and also some very negative ones. And I think that there is no more bitterness, no greater bitterness in my life than what the United States did to Nicaragua. So, how do I make these judgments? Well, they're long, I'm summarizing long conversations, right? I have a tendency to look this way, so if there are folks over here, go ahead.
I guess, back to the comment I made at the beginning of the lecture, I just wanted to share, I guess, an intuition that some of the problems arrive at the end of the lecture, some of these about the relationship between revolutionary violence and disintegration violence, and that has something to do, or those problems are derived from a conflation of uses of the word violence, from noun and verb, and maybe a transitive and intransitive sense of violence. And to think violence, we really need a discussion that accounts for the experience of the one so-called doing violence, as also a part of a violent experience, not just the one subjected to violence as being kind of the only part of the violence.
I think you got to be right about that. I think you do have to be right about that. And the only thing that was close, where I came close to saying, I did have a thing in my conclusion that I just kind of scrapped because I did want the time for discussion, is that to remember that violence is always a reciprocal phenomenon. There's always an actor and an acted upon. And one has to think through, but I argue that one has to think through it from the viewpoint of the victim. Now you're arguing the opposite, and
just
there's something that
the viewpoint of the perpetrator, but that if to think of the term violence in its broadest sense, it has to account for both experiences as experiences of violence.
yes, I give you that 100%. It's a good point.
I just wanted to say thank you to Ian.